We're catching up with Tom Ball, who is in Kyiv for the Times. Tom, while attention's been on Iran, on Gaza, Ukraine has been seeing some of the most fierce bombardments of the war. Tell us what's been going on.
Yeah, that's right. Over the weekend, the Russians launched more than 500 drones and missiles across Ukraine, which was a record-breaking figure, but it does come amid a dramatic escalation in their nightly bombardments of Ukraine. And President Zelensky said an extraordinary statistic the other day that since the start of the full-scale invasion over 3 years ago now, Russia has fired 10% of Shahed drones at Ukraine just in June alone, and that was not even by the end of the month then. So this is largely being driven by Shahed drones, which are this kind of smaller. Smaller. This is largely being driven by Shaheds, which carry a warhead of between 1 and 4 kilograms. So they're not as damaging as missiles, but the sheer quantity that they're now firing them at means that the Russians are trying to overwhelm Ukraine's defences essentially, and enable some of those to get through and to hit their targets. And as ever, really since the start of the invasion, the purpose of this really is just to try and break public morale.
So destroying public morale, if these Shaheds make it through, what kind of damage do they do to their targets?
I went to go and visit an apartment block just outside Kiev on Saturday, and they'd had a Shahed hit them about a week previously. They're pretty nasty. They will take out up to a dozen apartment flats, and they are often filled now with small ball bearings, which will disperse upon impact. Fortunately, in this instance, there were no casualties, but they do frequently kill people when they hit these targets.
And even as this amount of firepower is being sent by Russia, Russia's taking something of a victory lap. How big a deal is the announcement that the occupied Luhansk region is now fully controlled, they say, by Russia?
It's symbolically important. Luhansk is one of the two regions which make up Donbass, which has been the focal point of their military campaign since 2014. But for several weeks now, Deep State, which is the mapping service that run by the Ukrainians, which shows the front lines, has shown Luhansk to be virtually all but captured. So it's something that Putin will be very pleased to have been able to announce, but the writing's been on the wall for a few weeks now.
And the status of Luhansk has been one of Moscow's red lines in these peace talks. What do you make of the White House envoy claiming that Russia may be stalling for time in those peace talks over the war in Ukraine?
It's been stalling for time for months now. I mean, ever since Trump came into the White House and said that he was going to end the war within 24 hours, the Russians have been playing a game whereby they've been giving the impression that they are willing to sit down and talk and engage, while on the other hand having absolutely no intention whatsoever and continuing to bomb and strike Ukrainian cities every night, continuing to take losses of up to 1,000 men on the front lines each day. So Kellogg's absolutely right, but it's been the case for months now.
All of this comes as we start thinking about what the prospects are for Ukraine. You've been talking with Petro Poroshenko. He's a pretty high-profile former Ukrainian president and a rival to Zelensky. And he had some fairly strident criticism for Zelensky, didn't he?
He did. Essentially what he was saying was that Zelensky is behaving in an increasingly authoritarian manner, the backdrop to this is the fact that Poroshenko was sanctioned earlier this year by the government, which essentially prevents him from running in any future election, were there to be one, in the coming month, whenever it does happen. And his criticism was that Zelensky was attempting to take out all of his political competitors, essentially. He was trying to present the fact that he was, not wanting to be critical, but rather to give Zelensky advice, acknowledging the fact that what is so crucial currently is that Ukrainians stand united. But occasionally that, or more than occasionally, that advice, as he would call it, did seem to appear much more criticism than counsel. And particularly he was critical of the way in which Zelensky and his team had engaged with the Trump administration over peace talks, and said that they'd made many bad mistakes, that there was a serious communication problem, that the Americans didn't trust some of Zelensky's team, and he essentially said that the Ukrainian negotiating team didn't have a kind of clear enough understanding of the fact that Trump, more than anything, wants to have the international adulation of the people for having secured this, grand diplomatic coup of being able to claim that he was the one that brokered the ceasefire. And so he's suggested that the Zelensky team should have been perhaps more understanding of that and more willing to compromise and make gains later on. And in that he said that Zelensky could learn from Netanyahu, who he suggested had given Trump the kind of diplomatic coup of being able to claim that he had brokered that temporary ceasefire in Gaza earlier this year, and then later reaped the rewards of that by winning American engagement in attacks against the Iranian nuclear program last month.
It's also reported that the US is halting some weapons shipments to Ukraine. What are the prospects now for Ukraine? Could Trump just walk away as he threatened?
Well, I asked Poroshenko about this, and his response was absolutely not, that Trump wouldn't walk away. And my feeling also is that Trump probably wouldn't. That would be on his reputation for forever had he been the person that walked away and ceased to engage in the biggest European war since the Second World War. But it is true that it has become increasingly difficult to convince Trump that Ukraine is worthy of his interest and his attention. So that's what Zelensky and his team are currently working on. And I think there was some optimism coming out of the NATO summit last week, where Trump and Zelensky did have a conversation, and afterwards Trump described it as it couldn't have been nicer, I think was the phrase that he used.
Do you have a sense Poroshenko is kind of positioning himself to be a go-between with Trump, or a kind of potential president in any kind of post-Zelensky world where Trump does provide that kind of support?
I think he's certainly trying and has been trying to position himself as somebody who can speak for Ukraine in Washington. He had a couple of different diplomatic coups of his own when he was president. The Crimean Declaration, which Mike Pompeo, who was the then Secretary of State, signed, was an affirmation that America didn't recognize Russia's claim to the Crimea, which is a big thing at the time. He also convinced Trump to become the first US president to provide lethal weapons to Ukraine in 2017. So I think he sees those achievements as giving him a certain level of authority. And it was reported earlier this year that Poroshenko had been to Washington and had met with members of Trump's team. So that now is going to be more difficult for him because of the sanctions that he's under, which prevent him from travelling. And that was one of the big points that he was making, saying that by putting me under sanction, you are hampering my efforts to try and do what's best for Ukraine.